Welcome to the Comedy Reset Spotlight. This is the place to be if you want to hear from some of the most innovative and exciting comedy creators from around the globe. On this podcast, you'll hear from a variety of guests who are pushing the boundaries of what comedy can be. If you're looking for fresh perspectives and new ideas, this is the podcast for you.
Episode 31. New York City-based comedian, Jim Mendrinos.
Can you walk us through the moment or series of events that made you realize you wanted to pursue stand-up comedy?
I've always loved comedy, always. As a little kid, I was one of those weird little kids that would just sit up and listen to the Tonight Show comedians, or if Dean Martin roast was on, oh my God, I would memorize it. And then I'd come back to the schoolyard and just recite those jokes to all the kids that were there. I was the only 8-year-old who could do a full-on Foster Brooks impression. And it was always something that older men did. And then when I was around, I'd say 10 or 11 years old, I saw Freddie Prinze on the Midnight Special. And that changed everything because Freddie Prinze and I had such a similar background. We both grew up in New York City. We both lived in a tenement. We both had crazy supers. We both had mixed racial backgrounds. Him with being Puerto Rican and Hungarian, me with being Greek and Irish. So there was so much craziness that was going on that was similar. Plus, he was young. He wasn't even 19 yet, I don't think. Maybe 19, maybe 20. And I would watch him and see what he did, and it was just amazing. And it suddenly changed from something that I admired to something that I desired, something that I wanted to do. And I think seeing Freddie Prinze probably is what made me want to be a stand-up comedian, made me become a stand-up comedian, and shaped the whole course of my life.
Who were your comedic inspirations growing up, and how have they influenced your style or approach to comedy?
Wow, my comedic influences. So for me, the Mount Rushmore was probably Freddie Prinze, Robin Williams, Robert Klein is probably the third big one, and then Richard Pryor. Those four, combined just changed the way I looked at the world, let alone the way I looked at comedy. I think in my early phases, I was so much more trying to be like a Freddie Prinze or a Robert Klein, just that everyman talking about his own life experience in a way that was just gentle and relaxed. I think as I've matured and grown and evolved as a performer and as a person, the influence of Richard Pryor really started to come in. I wanted to speak more of my truth. I wanted to do longer bits. I wanted to do story form. And that's what I've eventually morphed into after all these years. But it was very transitory for me. I started with imitation. If you go back and listen to what I was doing in my first couple of years as a 19 and 20-year-old stand-up, it was damn near a Freddie Prinze impression. Then it morphed into a damn near a Robert Klein impression. Thank God I didn't have the talent to do Robin Williams, or I probably would have done a Robin Williams impression. I think we all start with being, influenced by, to the point of damn near doing an impression of the people that influence us before we find our own wings and start becoming ourselves. And I think that process is different for all of us, and I hope that younger comics now take a shorter time. But for me, it took a while to get there.
Describe the very first time you stepped onto a stage to perform stand-up. What was going through your mind, and how did that experience shape your subsequent performances?
So the first time I stepped on stage was at Catch a Rising Star in New York City. Remember everything about it. I remember waiting out the line the whole day. I remember talking to a pretty comic from Nashville, Tennessee, who had taken a bus up here so she could perform, and us flirting and having the times of our lives. There's a backstory to it in that I'd always loved comedy, and I got a job writing for a comedian a few weeks prior. And then my sister, Mary, my late sister Mary, took me to Catch a Rising Star as a birthday present for my 19th birthday, knowing how much I loved comedy. And so the very next week, I waited out that line and I performed. And everything about it was magical. I had spent the whole week crafting material and writing it and getting it to be perfect for me. And I had 5 minutes, and I'm the particular kind of specific where if I know I have 5 minutes, I had that time down to the second. And because I had been in the club the week before, the MC, by the time I got on stage, which was well after midnight, closer to 1 a.m., she saw me and she said, "Hey, just do me a favor, don't get off stage so you see the light." I believe she thought I was a comic that she recognized. What she didn't realize was she just recognized me from the audience the previous week. And I did my 5 minutes, and they were quite mediocre, as is many of our first times. And I had a couple of people that were friends of mine in the audience laughing. And then at the end of that 5 minutes, she was nowhere to be seen. And I had to improvise. And that was exhilarating and soul-crushing and terrifying. I had gone through everything I planned to write. I had gone through everything that I had written. I had gone through everything that was just premises that I didn't even develop. And at the end of my set, I was going, would the joke have been better if I had done it this way? And by the time she took me off stage, I wasn't sure if I was, loving this or feeling like I was being murdered. I do know that I wound up, as we did in the 80s, hooking up with the young comic from Nashville and following her back to Nashville for a couple of weeks. And kind of that solidified it. Like, oh, man, I can do this and meet the pretty girls and, and get the exhilaration of being on stage for a 19-year-old comedian. That was amazing and just life-changing.
Comedy is an evolving art form. How have you seen your own comedic style change and mature over the years?
Comedy is absolutely a conversation. It's not a lecture. It's not, it's not a monologue. It's not a soliloquy. It is a conversation. And it took me forever to realize that. And it's also, when done correctly, the microcosm of your life. It is an ecosystem where you share with the audience who you are right at this moment. And I, now in my 50s, am way different than I was when I started out at 19. So my act has had to evolve just sheerly because of time, sheerly because of experience. Stylistically, I've also evolved. I've evolved from somebody who stood on stage and, just spit out quick punchlines as quick as he could, because that's what I was able to do when I was 19 years old, to somebody that stands on stage and tells longer, complex, evolved stories. And that's not an accident. That's getting comfortable in my own skin, growing, listening to the changes of my desires as an artist, and not trying to jam a square peg into a round hole. It should, if you do this right, be maximizing your comfort on stage and infusing the audience with the information that you want them to understand. If you listen to what's important to you, you'll find that the conversations that you have with the audience get deeper. They get more complex. They get a lot richer for you as a performer. You get a lot more satisfaction. I'm sure that when I was talking a lot faster and just spitting out one-liners at the speed of sound, I'm positive I probably got more laughs per minute than I get now. I have better sets now. I'm a better comic now. And that's the big change that evolves. You feel comfortable with what you want to talk about and how you want to talk about it. And you allow yourself to just talk freely. That comes with time. That comes with confidence. That comes with experience. And eventually the need to please the audience is superseded by the need to please yourself. And then the next step in that evolution is the bid to please the art. I want to make the art as good as I can. And yes, stand-up is an art as far as I'm concerned. And I want to present it that way. I want to treat it with respect that it's never shown. I want to show people that this is a beautiful, intense, and complex art form. And that's what I strive to do every day right now.
Can you share a particularly challenging gig or phase in your early career? And what lessons did you take away from it?
There were a lot of particularly challenging gigs when I first started. Like any comic who started in the 80s, I went through performing in, concert venues, outdoor venues, colleges, all of these were challenging. I've done so many festivals early in my career. It was amazing. The outdoor venues or opening for rock and roll acts were particularly difficult. I've done dive bars, I've done rock bars, I've opened for punk bands, and boy, that is difficult. I did more than my fair share of strip clubs. And as a 20-year-old, I can remember distinctly performing in retirement villages on Long Island and in Florida. And all of those were very challenging. But the most particularly challenging and the most shaping of gigs that I had early was the first time I headlined. Because comedy in the 1980s was different. It was booming. And there were so many people that needed comedians. There were so many people that needed performers, and there weren't enough performers to go around. So people were getting snatched and called to do spots that they were not ready for. And I was no exception. I barely had 25 minutes of written material. My longest time on stage, I think might have been 10 minutes at this point. And I had been recommended for a gig in Williamstown, Mass, where I would be headlining and required to do 45 minutes, and there would be a couple, 2-3 local openers in front of me, and then me doing 45 minutes. And I, like every comic in the world, let Ubers take over, and when offered the gig, looked at it and said, well, it's 2 months away. Yeah, I'll do the gig. And I knew that I could write the extra 25 minutes of material because, like I said, I had about 25 minutes of written material, and you want a little cushion. So if I could double my material amount, I'd have enough time. But the other part of it was getting the experience to be on stage for 45 minutes. That was going to be a leap. At this point, my longest set was 10 minutes. So I took those 2 months and I went on a writing binge, and I begged, borrowed, and stole for any longer sets I could. But even with all that in the 2 months, I was confident that I had enough material, but I still had not done a set longer than 25 minutes, and 25 was difficult. And I don't know if anybody who hasn't done it before, when you go and you make that leap into headlining and you're doing those longer sets, those 45-minute sets, if you hadn't done 45 minutes, you don't realize how much energy is being output. You don't understand how much adrenaline is pumping through your system. You don't understand how taxing it is on a lot of levels that you just didn't expect it to be taxing on. So I went up there, and on the first show, I did everything. I did everything I could as best as I could, and I came in at 43 minutes, which was close enough that nobody noticed, but I noticed. And I then spent the 2 hours in between my spot and the next show just really studying my notes, making corrections, determined to make the next show be at least 45 minutes. And it taught me one of the most valuable lessons that I could have ever been taught, and that was to prepare for every set. I don't take any set for granted. If somebody says, can you do a clean set? I've done hundreds of clean sets. I've performed at churches my whole career. I still prep for it. I still look over the material. I still select a set. Somebody says, hey, can you perform on a corporate show? Please don't do these bits. I look through my material. I double check. I make sure things don't touch those subjects. I do the work. The more effort you put in before you get on stage, the more fun you can have once you're on the stage, because you don't have to think about things. You don't have to panic and, craft on the moment. You get to just flow. That was a really important set for me to learn early on. And I'm not going to say that 45 minutes was, brilliant, because it was far from brilliant. When I look back at the material I was doing at that phase of my career, the fact that anybody ever paid me was a minor miracle. But what I will say is It was a lesson in what needs to be done in order to do this professionally. And I'm very grateful I got that lesson that early in my career.
How do you handle the inevitable bombing on stage, and what strategies do you employ to bounce back?
Everyone bombs. There is no doubt about that. It's going to happen, and sometimes it's going to happen in the weirdest of moments. Sometimes you can just walk into a room and know it's not your night, and sometimes you walk on stage thinking everything's going to be great, and it hits you out of the blue and like a ton of bricks. And there really is no way to prep for bombing. You do, like your question says, have to handle bombing, which is a different animal. It's what you need to do to build the emotional and psychological backbone to not judge yourself by the quality of your last set. I by no means think I am as great as I am the handful of times I got standing ovations, and I do not think I'm as bad as I seem those times when I bomb. And this is because I look at the overall quality of it. What has helped me get through this is being focused every set on mission statements. When I go on stage, I have things that I'm working on, whether it's, a 10-minute spot in the city at a showcase club, or if I'm doing, an hour on a private gig. I still go on stage and I say, what do I need to work on this show? I'm working on movement. I'm working on eye contact. I'm working on slowing down the rate with which I speak. I'm working on this particular story. I have something that I'm working on. And the moments where those sets aren't going the way I want them to go, what I'm able to do now on stage is slow down and then go to my internal working and just work on the things I want to work on. It almost becomes a rehearsal in the moment. And then afterwards, when I listen to the set, and I do listen to the sets where I bomb, I'm listening for what I did work-wise. Now, I'm also going to go back and listen to them and see if there's anything I did performance-wise that contributed to my bombing. But I'm staying focused on the work. And that gets me through that bombing feeling. That makes it so I'm not completely crushed. Now, are you going to lick your wounds? Absolutely. Especially if you bomb in front of somebody that you don't want to bomb in front of. Friends and family in the audience is a big one. A comic that you really want to impress. Or sometimes even at an audition, you might bomb and you really wanted that business opportunity. You have to realize that you're going to be doing this a long time. You're going to be performing many places. So just allow yourself to let that set go, learn from it, and move on to the next one.
Walk us through your process of creating a new joke or bit. Do you start with a premise, a punchline, or something else entirely?
My process for creating a new bit kind of is overly complex for no reason, but it works for me. And that is, I start probably months and months and months in advance because I'm constantly writing down notes. Every time something strikes me as funny, every time I think I might be able to mine comedy from something, I jot it down. And at the moment I jot it down, I also jot down why I think it's funny. The why is the key for me, because comedy isn't intellectual. Comedy is visceral. When you hear something, you either laugh or don't laugh. It gets you or it doesn't get you. You don't stop to think about it and then laugh. You stop to think about it, you're probably going to laugh like, oh, yeah, that was funny. And we don't want an audience doing that. We want an audience with the snot coming out of their noses, laughing uncontrollably, eyes watering. And that only comes when we get them emotionally. It's not surprise, it's connection that gets that reaction. So when I think of something, and jot down why I think it's funny, it does two things. Number one, it makes it so that 6 years from now, if I find the note in a batch of papers that, were lost for some reason, and I just see Pigeon, Pigeon on the subway. Why do I think Pigeon on the subway was funny? But if I see Pigeon on the subway, how lazy is he? The why I think it's funny, then I have direction. I also am pointing the audience at what I want them to think about and what I want them to laugh at. I then proceed to overwrite. And my first thing is when I'm working on any topic, I free write the judgment-free pages. I'm not even worried about it being funny. And I write to exhaustion. And the second I write to exhaustion, I put it down and I don't come at it again for a couple of days. And then a couple of days later, I pick it up again and then I write to as many tangents as I can think of. What are the things that are connected to it? If I'm writing about amusement parks, I'm going to write about the rides. I'm going to write about the games. I'm going to write about the food. I'm going to write about the fact that it's usually on the beach. I'm going to write about kids. I'm going to write about families. I'm going to write about vacations. I'm going to find all the tangents that are usually attached to that subject. And then I'm going to stop. And then the next day I'm going to go through. I'm going to highlight the bits that I think have the most comedic potential. And I'm going to disregard the rest. And once I have those bits with potential, I'm going to punch them up, take a shot at really inserting as many jokes as I can. Then I'm going to put it away again for a couple of days. And I'm going to go back and reread it because sometimes in the excitement of creation, you think something is great, and then 3 days later you read it and you go, that's kind of mediocre. So a couple of days later when I'm reading it, it'll allow me to edit it down again and this time shape it. And then once I'm done shaping it, I start taking it to the stage and I toggle back and forth between the stage and the page until it is shaped the way I want it to. So sometimes I can be working on a bit for a month and a half before I even start bringing it to the stage, and then 2 or 3 months on stage, and then working that for as long as that bit still seems relevant. I think everyone's going to have a different process, but that's how my process is unfolded over time. I think the key to that for me is it allows me to find things that I'm excited about talking about, and I find the emotional connection that I'm leading the audience to. And that really helps in my writing process.
How do you decide which topics are off limits for you, if any? And how do you navigate sensitive subjects in your comedy?
This is probably the easiest question for me to answer here. Because for me, there are no sensitive subjects. There are no off-limits topics, except the ones I'm uncomfortable talking about. If I'm comfortable enough to talk about it, then I'm comfortable enough to talk about it on stage. And that, to me, is the rule. So I can talk about race. I can talk about politics. I can talk about art. I can talk about science. I can talk about any of the things that are hot button issues. I can talk about religion on stage because I'm comfortable talking about those subjects. Oddly, there are family members of mine that I never talk about on stage because I'm not comfortable talking about them on stage, either because I know they wouldn't like it or I just don't like talking about them. And those are people that, for me, are off limits. The line should and always must be for an artist what we are comfortable talking about, what we are comfortable developing. Nothing else. Now, there are those things that are considered taboo. You don't want to talk about race. You don't want to talk about politics. You don't want to offend your audience. And I don't care if you are offended. If I say something and you're offended by it, I really need you to understand how much I clearly don't give a fuck that you're offended. I never say anything with the intention of hurting somebody, with the possible exception of sometimes in political material I am a bit deliberately mean, but I'm looking to aim it at that political target as opposed to I'm looking to offend all people who believe in this belief system. I'm never trying to make a person feel like an idiot. Sometimes I'm trying to attack ideals that I think don't make sense. So since I'm not deliberately trying to hurt somebody, I don't think, for me, there's a line. Now, the other side of that coin is everyone believes there's a line. And there's a third side to that coin in that I do this professionally. This is how I make my living. And sometimes you take a gig and they say, don't talk about X. And if you're going to be a big boy and take their money, you need to respect their wishes and not talk about X because it is a condition of employment. So I am free to talk about politics, But if I'm working a gig and they say, hey, absolutely no politics on stage, then for that gig, if I want that money, I can't talk about that subject. That's how I navigate it.
Share with us one of the most memorable moments you've had on stage, whether it was a surprising audience reaction, an unexpected event, or a personal breakthrough.
Early in my career, I worked at the comic strip in New York City, and Sam Kinison had just come into town. And on a weekend show where they put the strongest act on at the end and they put Kinison on at the end, it wasn't an issue. But on the weeknights, they would put the strongest act on smack dab in the middle of the show because the shows ran well into the late evenings. So they wanted to make sure that in the meat of the show, the best acts were on stage. And Sam would get spots smack dab right in the middle of that show. And the comic that was supposed to be on after him would always be remarkably late. Just so late. We used to lovingly refer to that as the Kinison flu, in that comics didn't exactly want to go up after what he did to a room, so they would just be late for their spot so that somebody else had to bite that bullet. I was brand spanking new in the club, and I was hanging out for late night, and I was eager to do spots. And Lucian, in his infinite wisdom, knew that since I was going to be there anyway, and whoever was going to go on after Sam was going to bomb, decided that for at least a short time, I was going to have the post-Kinison spot. So that I would be thrown to the wolves, the audience would then hate me, and then love the next comic on stage. And I remember Sam coming on stage, and I'm standing in that little back area waiting to be introduced, and him telling me, you're going to learn how to follow me. It's going to make you a better comic. And I remember one night going up after him, and just, as all comics do, we all do impressions of each other on occasion, doing an impression of Sam as a Catskills comic in his 60s. And the audience had just seen Sam, and I'm like, take my wife, please. Oh! And I'm doing the yells and all of that. And the audience was eating it up. And then they decided, okay, this guy's cool. And then they just listened to my set, and I started getting laughs. And I learned that it is so much better to follow somebody that destroys the room, that gets a standing ovation, that is a monster comic. It's better to follow greatness than it is to follow somebody that just crapped out the stage. I'd rather follow standing ovation than follow somebody bombing. And that's the moment I realized that. The moment where my fear went away and I'm there like, oh no, they're primed. They want to laugh. Because let's face it, that Kinison impression wasn't that good and that joke was pretty bad. But the audience just loved it because they were in the mood to laugh. And that's an important lesson for a young comic to learn. The audience wants to laugh. The audience wants to have a good time. And if you just allow them to have a good time, they will.
Have you ever had an interaction with a fan or audience member that deeply impacted you or changed the way you approach comedy?
I know this is going to sound cliche, but this is the absolute truth. I never really thought much about our impact to the audience. I never really thought much about how we placed into society until I started doing AFE tours, Armed Forces Entertainment. And I went to the Middle East, and I was in Djibouti and Bahrain and UAE and Oman, just a whole lot of places. And I was on one base that was a lockdown base. They don't allow the soldiers on base to tell their family, where they are. They don't allow the soldiers on base to communicate with their family. Basically, they have to stay on base, and it's a 6 or 8 month deploy, and it's really a lot of time away from the family. And when we go on those bases, the job is to be funny on stage, but you're also living on the base. And we were on one base for 4 days, and I remember playing cards with the soldiers and sitting there and joking with them, and just, sitting looking at the night sky and eating with them and all of that stuff. And there was a younger soldier, I at the time was in my 40s, and he couldn't have been older than 20, 21. maybe. And we played a lot of cards, and he was from Brooklyn, and we shared a lot of stories. And as I was leaving, he comes up to me and he says, "Can you do me a favor?" And I said, "Sure, what you need?" And he goes, "Listen, I can't tell my mom where I am because I'm on this base. But my brother passed away during the Iraq War, and I know my mom is incredibly worried. Can you please, when you get back to the States, here's my family's phone number. Can you call her, tell her you saw me, tell her you can't tell her where you saw me, but tell her that I'm okay?" And I said, "Yeah, absolutely, I'll do that for you." Cut to the end of the tour. I get back. I call his mom. I say, "Ma'am, I need to talk to you about your son." And she's like panicked. Then I share that with her. And I've never heard more joy across a phone line than I did with that phone call. It was absolute, unadulterated joy and peace. And that family has embraced me. They've invited me for barbecues, holiday functions. There was one Thanksgiving where I had no place to go post divorce, and they took me in, and it was life changing to see the impact that I had on him at the base, and then the family in the connection of the world. I don't know that it's changed the way I approach my comedy, writing comedy and performing comedy, but it's changed the way I view comedy. I no longer view it as this is something that I do, purely selfishly. I now view it as this is something where if I do it right, I'm bringing some peace and joy to other people. And that makes a tremendous difference.
How do you feel about the current trends in stand-up comedy, especially with the rise of online platforms and social media influencing the comedic landscape?
Comedy evolves, and as an older comic, I've either got to evolve with the art form or I have to let it go. And yes, the online platforms and social media influencing comedy, and the fact that there are, TikTok stars with 5 minutes of material and 1 million followers who are now closing shows. It's a different landscape than when I started. It's a different business than when I started. But at the core, it's still the same. We're still people that are trying to make people happy and laugh based upon the creation of our art form. And that's what we're looking to do. I'd like to get better at social media. I'd like to get better, at using the online platforms. And I'm working on it. But for me, I'm not the old guy standing on the lawn screaming, "Kids, get off my grass." It's a different art form. The onus isn't on them to do what I used to do. The onus is on me evolving to what needs to be done for this market. And I either will or I won't. I'm either going to be able to do it or I'm not going to be able to do it. But for every older comic that's screaming, "Oh, the business is changing, it's not as good, it sucks." No, it doesn't suck. It's different. And find your joy in this new landscape. That's what we need to do. I really view the younger generation of comics as what keeps me sharp. Because when I have to follow some 25-year-old whose references are more relevant than mine because he's younger and the audience is younger, and I'm pushed to find things that are more relevant for the younger generation of audience that's out now, that comic's made me better. I shouldn't, chide him for doing what he's doing. I should thank him for doing what he's doing because he's making me have to step up my game. And that's how I'm going to be better as an artist as I get older.
There's been a lot of discussion about cancel culture and comedy. What's your perspective on the balance between pushing boundaries and being respectful?
All right, so talk about whatever you want to talk about. There is no cancel culture. What there is consequences. If you want to talk about something and somebody is offended by it, they have a right to be offended by it. You also have the right to talk about what you want to talk about. And you just have to be a big boy or a big girl and deal with the consequences of talking about those things. I think that if you have a code, and you stick to that code. I'm not deliberately trying to hurt anybody. Have there been times where my material has offended somebody, has hurt somebody? Yes, it has, but it's never been my intention. That's a major difference. That's a major change, and that will make it easier to defend what I've done. If you perform long enough, if you do stand up over a course of generations, and I'm lucky enough to be in that position, you'll have jokes that you'll look back at and go, I wish I knew then what I knew now. And the cancel culture only gets ridiculous when it reaches out of time. If you want to cancel something if you want to cancel somebody for something they said back in 1979, when it was a different society and a different value system, then you're being a bit of a jerk. But if it's 2024 and somebody's saying those same things, well, there's repercussions now, and we need to understand that. So say what you want to say. There is no cancel culture. What there is repercussions. And you can either design your act so safe that it is beyond reproach, or you can be really solid and talk about the things you want to talk about and accept responsibility if somebody gets offended, and be willing to defend your position if you need to.
How do you see the future of stand-up comedy evolving, especially in a post-pandemic world where virtual shows have become more prominent?
People will always need to laugh. People will always want to have fun. This art form is not going anywhere. It is a beautiful and wonderful art form. Now, will it be online? Yeah. Will it also be live? Yeah. Are we starting to see a decline in traditional comedy clubs and more of an opening up of spots that do comedy once or twice a week? Yeah, that's also happening. It will change and morph in the presentation, but the expectation and the goal will remain the same. Be funny, get laughs. That's not going to change. And in a post-pandemic world where there are virtual shows, it's also going to live longer. Your set is not going to be as disposable as it once was. There are sets that I did in 1987 when I walked off that stage, and if I didn't record that night, nobody but memories have any idea that it even actually happened. Whereas now, it will have a footprint on the World Wide Web till the end of time. So just be accepting of that, understand that, and have fun with that. And the greatest part of it is I've got 2 or 3 tapes to look back at when I was a young performer, things that have survived my dozens of movings over the years. And I can look back and watch a set I did when I was 20 years old and go, wow, such a young man. You guys are going to be able to do that with a click of a mouse. And that's going to be awesome for you all.
If you had to describe your comedic style in 3 words, what would they be and why?
Describe that comedic style in 2 words, comedic storytelling. And that's what I do on stage. That's what it's evolved to. I tell longer stories. I tell them comedically, and I have fun doing it. So in the storytelling tradition, the ones that we heard from Newhart and Cosby way back to masters like Ron Schock, who is somebody that I hope you guys get to know via YouTube over time. There's a great tradition of comedic storytellers, and for me, that's where I am right now. That's what's fun for me as an artist right now, and I have a feeling that's where I'm going to keep growing into over the next few years of my act.
Who are some current comedians you admire or believe are pushing the boundaries of the art form?
Billy Burr, Ricky Gervais, Schultz, Chris Rock, Taylor Tomlinson. These and more are just great comics that are still in some cases and now emerging to push the envelope of our art form, just to make it a little bit better, to widen the reach. And it's great. But there's also 1,000,001 young artists that are doing it too, people that aren't as well known. from a Liz Mealy right down to you could go to any local comedy club and find 1, 2, 3, 4 artists that are really influencing you. I think that it's a really golden time in the industry because there are more places to perform right now, so there are more voices to be heard. And the more voices that we could hear, the wider the net becomes of what comedy is. And that's just going to make it better and deeper and richer. And the more we can widen the scope of what defines stand-up comedy, the more you're going to welcome in new artists. So new artists generate more new artists. And that's a beautiful thing about our art form. Now, in terms of people that are absolutely influencing me, right now, probably more than anybody, I'm listening to a lot of Billy Burr. That's probably my go-to at this moment. And there are other voices as well that are out there that I really like. But I think if I were talking about what I'm listening to on Sirius XM as I'm driving, probably more Billy than anyone else.
Comedy often serves as a reflection of society. How do you incorporate your personal experiences and observations about the world into your sets?
Comedy tends to be either observation or autobiography. It's either I'm observing something, then reminding you of it, and we're all going to laugh together at it, or I'm going to point out my emotional connection, my feeling, my participation in X. And my act is solidly in the latter category. It is not totally void of observations. Every once in a while I will talk about something that doesn't directly affect me, but I go out of the way to make sure that the word I appears in every bit I write, that my point of view, my personal experience, my history, my values are reflected in what I'm talking about. For a couple of reasons. Number one is kind of like talking about myself. I think a lot of comics do. But number two, the more personal your experience, the less generic your material is. When I'm talking about being tossed out of a laundromat because they're upset that I have racist socks, how many people have that experience? How many people could go steal that and do it on another TV show? It's mine. It's mine alone because I mined it from my life, because it's taken from a real life event that happened to me in a laundromat in Colonia, New Jersey. That's the importance of having personal attachment to material. And a reflection of society. That bit touches on societal issues. That bit touches on, as we were talking about earlier, cancel culture. That bit touches on expectations. And that's the interesting thing when we talk about ourselves, because we are a member of society. We do talk about world experiences. Every bit becomes, a socially relevant bit if you include yourself within that bit.
For aspiring comedians listening to this podcast, what piece of advice would you give them that you wish someone had given you when you were starting out?
I think the best advice I had ever gotten was work more off stage than you work on stage. Just make sure you're prepared every time you walk on stage, and you do that by writing every day, by performing as often as you can, by hunting out gigs as often as you can, by making sure that you're networking as often as you can. Now we would add creating a social media presence so you could grow your audience as often as you can. You have to do the work off stage to earn your time on stage. I don't feel this is an exaggeration. Nobody's ever paid me to do stand-up. I would do stand-up for free. Think of how many times you as a performer, you've jumped on stage because somebody offered you a spot and like, fuck yeah, I'll do a spot. We all want to be on stage, but we got to earn our time on stage. We have to earn our audience members. And if we want to get paid, we have to earn our money. And all of that requires us doing work developing our acts, work developing our reach, and works developing our contacts. Those are all things we need to work on. And I wish somebody would have told me that a lot earlier than I learned it. It might have shaved a couple of years off my journey. I also think that it's important that we understand that outside eyes are key. It's odd because I get hired as a comedy writer all the time, and there's a stigma attached to it. Like, oh my God, I can't believe I have to hire a writer. Well, nobody can do all of this by themselves, or very few of us can do all of this by ourselves. And sometimes having that outside eye look at what you're doing and going, hey, have you thought about X, Y, and Z is incredibly valuable. Now, that doesn't have to come in the form of somebody you pay. If you've got a good peer group that you're willing to, help each other out on, that's great. But there is no shame in getting help from a peer, taking advice from somebody within the industry, or even hiring somebody to help you with what you're doing, to teach you more skills. That's not something you should be ashamed of. That's an investment in your art. And that's what we need to do all the time.
Finally, what's next for you in your comedic journey? And where can our listeners catch your next performance?
I think what's next for me is more theatrical-based shows, developing theatrical-based shows so that I can get myself out there on a larger scale. Where I am right now, and people can find me all the time, you can come to the Comedy Diner in Newark, New Jersey, which is a club that I opened with another comedic buddy of mine. And we're trying to get Newark's first and only full-time comedy club off the ground so that we can have a place for artists to develop. Obviously, you can catch a couple of specials of mine on Amazon Video Direct. Not Dead Yet is the most recent one. I am in the throes of starting to develop the next one, which I'm hoping to record in February of this coming year. And so that is the next step in the evolution. And then finally, I think if you really want to find me and you really want to, just contact me, just reach out to me on the socials, DM me, ask me where I'm going to be, and I will be happy to tell you where I'm going to be. I'm always looking to meet with new audience members, but also new comics. Feel free to ask questions. I'm really accessible. And if you want some help, I'm around.
I've been your host, Rob Chaffee. Don't forget to laugh today. It's good for you. Comedy Reset Spotlight is a podcast that brings you today's freshest and funniest comedy creators. If you like what you heard, please subscribe to hear more.